Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching What is Active Directory and Why You Need to Care. In this video, we're going to start off by talking about what is Active Directory and, well, again, why should I care? We're going to talk about what are domain controllers, what are domains, what's a server role, and a little bit about what's DNS. We'll talk more about that later on, actually all throughout the course, but especially towards the end in the certification section. So enough talking, let's get into it here. Let's talk about what Active Directory really is and why you need to care. Well, first of all, Active Directory is the brain of a Windows Server network. If you don't have Active Directory, well, then what you have is what we call a work group. And there's only so much you can really do with a work group in terms of centralized management. And while work groups are certainly valid ways to network, a small amount of computers, once you get above about 10 or 20 computers using a work group, it can be a nightmare pretty fast, especially when it comes to security. So where Active Directory is, it's really a database that just keeps a track of a huge amount of stuff. And it gives us a centralized way to manage all of our client computers, our users, our printers, our resources, shared folders, all kinds of stuff. It really boils down to three primary types of stuff, though, okay? First of all, it handles users and groups. Now, user accounts are vital to the security of a network. You don't want just anybody walking in off the street and being able to access the stuff on your network. So that's a pretty vital element right there. It also keeps track of services, and it can handle providing access to email servers and whatever other kinds of application servers you might have on your network that are Active Directory integrated. But it also handles things like printers, shared folders, and a lot of other stuff that I don't have up on here, but it also handles things like computer accounts, and it manages your computers. There's just a massive amount of stuff that Active Directory does. Now, when we handle all of these kinds of things in Active Directory, we say that these items, like a user account, is an object in an Active Directory database. So a printer entry in Active Directory would be considered to be an object in Active Directory. So you'll hear me kind of bounce back and forth in some terminology, but an Active Directory object is really just a thing that Active Directory keeps track of. Now, as a matter of fact, here's the deal. Every time you log into a corporate network, in most corporations, and again, unless you have like 10 people or less, chances are you're probably using Active Directory if it's a Windows-based network. So here's how the process basically works, okay? Let's say that you walk in the front door and you log in to your client computer like you usually do. Well, you send a login request over to a machine called a domain controller. Now, the domain controller, what it does with that login request is it says, hey, hold up, let me check the Active Directory database to see if you actually get access or not. So it goes through and it checks the Active Directory database that it holds and checks to see if you actually have a valid account and sees what permissions that you have. So once it finds your user account, assuming that you've typed in your username and password like you should correctly, it says, okay, hey, you know what? I see your user account. It's valid and it has these permissions and rights. Here you go, and it sends back information back to your client computer with the stuff that you're allowed to have on the network. Now, it's kind of an oversimplification a little bit, but that's basically in a nutshell what happens when you log into an Active Directory Windows network. Now, let's talk about domain controllers for just a second. I kind of threw that word out at you now, so let's go ahead and stop and define it for a second. A domain controller is a Windows Server machine that runs Active Directory domain services. Now, don't be confused by this domain services part. Basically, if you see Active Directory domain services, what you have is Active Directory, okay? Active Directory domain services is just what we call a server role that actually is the Active Directory component of your Windows Server network. Now, I want you to think of your domain controller really as the boss of your network. It's really the brain, okay, of the core of your network here. And I do want to let you know that in most networks, you'll probably have multiple domain controllers that all have copies of the same Active Directory database. So in our actual Global Mantix scenario, we'll end up building 3 domain controllers initially. We'll actually end up building more than that. But each domain controller will have the same copy of the database. And when changes get made to one database, the domain controllers talk back and forth. And what they do is they share the changes that they've received in a process that we call replication. And we'll talk more about replication throughout the course. But I wanted to throw these terms out at you just so you know and you've seen and you've heard them before, okay? So domain controllers really are the bosses of your network, and they hold the Active Directory database files that we use to keep track of stuff. All right, now let's talk about the term domain for just a second. Now I know a lot of you are already familiar with the term domain because every time you type in www.microsoft.com or wherever website you type in, you're actually typing in a domain name. A lot of times we'll say that that is a namespace, which is a really big fancy word for a naming scheme. Okay, let me go ahead and kind of get into this a little bit. A Windows Server domain is really a logical group of computers that are running versions of Microsoft Windows, and they share a central directory database. Okay, now what makes them part of the quote-unquote namespace, or part of the domain, if you will, is that really they're all named with part of a domain name, like globomantics.com, which is also, by the way, considered to be a suffix when we include it in a computer name, and they're registered in the Active Directory database so that they can be managed. All right, so let's go ahead and take a quick look at what that might look like. Let's say we have a domain controller for globomantics.com. Here's our domain name. Well, this domain controller, its name is actually nydc1.globomantics.com, making it part of the Globomantics namespace. What makes it part of the namespace? This stuff right here, .globomantics.com. Now let's say we have some client machines. Let's say we have some Vista machines out on our network, which is going to be pretty likely. Well, if we have cl1.globomantics.com, cl2, and cl3, all having globomantics.com in the name of the machine, and these machines are registered in the Active Directory database, these machines are considered to be part of the namespace. So really, the word namespace is kind of a big fancy 50-cent word that really means that they're part of an Active Directory domain or a Windows Server domain. They're part of one whole network. Now, a lot of times you'll see domains represented with triangles in network diagrams like what you're seeing here. I just want to kind of talk to you about what this might mean and throw a few more terms at you when we're talking about domains, okay? Now, first of all, when you have multiple domains, a lot of times we say that we'll often have a forest of domains, okay? Now, a forest is comprised of all of the domains in your enterprise. So in this instance, you see we have globomantics.com, and by the way, globomantics.com is considered to be our forest root. Basically, it's our very first domain in our forest, all right? And you may only have one domain in your forest, just so you know. Now, a lot of times we'll say that like a child domain, like what we have here with na.globomantics.com, we say that this is part of a tree in the forest. But I want you to keep in mind that a forest is comprised of all of the domains in your whole enterprise. Now, when you're looking at a domain diagram like this, I want you to remember that these triangles also are representative of all of the stuff in that domain too, like all the user accounts, all the computers, all the domain controllers, all of the other servers that are part of that domain. And similar to it also in your child domain. So we might have two domains in our forest. And each one of these domains has its own user accounts, its own computer accounts, its own domain controllers, etc., etc. All right? And by the way, I am going to show you in this video series how to create a child domain like this, na.globomantics.com. Actually, we will be creating this during our video series. So just kind of keep that in mind. Now we have a basic idea of what is a domain. It's basically a quote-unquote namespace to which user accounts, computer accounts, and such belong. Well, we should probably talk about the user side too here. Don't forget the users are also part of the namespace. And for an example, your email address is part of a domain namespace. What makes it part of the domain space? This guy right here. So here we have hrichardson@globomantics.com, and it looks a lot like an email address. Well, it is an email address if you have an email server at globomantics.com that's registered with DNS servers out there on the internet. But users are also part of your domain namespace. And by the way, as you're going to see much later on in this video, you can actually use email style logins for logging into a network. We call these user principal names, by the way, when you use them to log into a Server 2008 network. Do you have to use them? No. It's just kind of an interesting way, and you'll see the purpose of them later on in the video series when we get to that particular section. All right, so let's talk now about server roles. We've talked about domains. We've talked about what is a domain controller. Now, a server role, this is specifically for Windows servers, by the way. Basically, servers need jobs, okay? And when you install Server 2008, as you're going to find out in the very next video, that the server doesn't come with any jobs. You have to decide which jobs that server is going to do. So a server role is basically just a major job that a server can perform, like, oh, I don't know, Active Directory domain services. And it's recommended, though, that a server not have too many roles, okay? Because you want your servers to perform well. You want them to have only a small amount of jobs if it's at all possible. Now, a domain controller, when you're installing it, it only has usually 2 roles. Active Directory domain services, which brings you the Active Directory, and also DNS, okay, domain name services. Now, especially in a Server 2008 network, in just a second here, we're going to talk about DNS. DNS is a vital part. If you don't have DNS running in your network, you're not going to have a network that's going to work, all right? I guess you could use it as a work group, but that's only so useful when you have 500 machines and 500 users. Now, DNS is a service that's provided by a server that allows you to find other computers in your network. Now, I know this is probably just review for you, because at this point, I'm expecting you to have at least a Network Plus background. But just in case you don't, here's just a quick review. DNS allows you to type in a friendly name of a machine instead of its IP address. And that allows your client machine to get the IP address from the DNS server and go find the resource. Now again, I'm going to talk to you more about DNS way later on in the certification section, but this is basically what DNS does for you. And without DNS, Active Directory will not work, period. Mostly because when you have machines, when you have client machines in your network, they have IP addresses. They have to be able to find different resources throughout your network, including your domain controllers, okay? If your client machines cannot find your domain controllers, nothing happens, okay? You've got a whole bunch of very expensive paperweights. So DNS is a critical part of Active Directory. It works together in tandem with it. Now, in Server 2008, if it's possible, it's recommended that you integrate your domain name services with Active Directory to make your life easier. Now, you don't have to. You can have separate DNS servers on your network, and some people don't even have Windows servers running their DNS. A lot of folks have Linux DNS servers out there. So keep that in mind, but regardless of whether you have an Active Directory integrated DNS, which we'll talk about throughout the course, or if you have a standalone DNS, doesn't matter. You gotta have a DNS system in place for Active Directory to work. What you're going to find out in the very next video is that DNS can be installed as a server role the very same time you're installing Active Directory domain services. When you do that, you're actually creating a little bit of an easier way to get your DNS out there and really have a DNS server that just simply works, okay? Now, DNS is a whole different class, to tell you the truth, but I wanted to bring this to you, to your knowledge, because if you don't have DNS running, or if it's not running right, then you're going to have problems with Active Directory. All right, well, that's enough front loading, because I really want to get you into the hands-on part of this course. I want you to start digging in, but I wanted to throw these terms out at you so that when you see them all throughout the course, they're not scary, that you'll have at least seen them once, and as we go throughout the course, you're going to see each one of these terms defined more, and more in each different video. So let's talk about what we covered, and let's get into installing those first 2 domain controllers. So we should now be able to define briefly what Active Directory is. You should be able to describe what 3 primary types of objects the Active Directory provides and tracks. Of course, there's more than just what we defined in that one little slide, but at least it starts to give you an idea of what's in Active Directory. I want you to be able to describe what happens when you log into an Active Directory network. It's a pretty simple thing. Your domain controller checks to see if your account is valid, if you've typed in your password correctly, and then provides you permissions and access. you should now be able to define what a domain controller is. Remember, that guy's just a server that is running Active Directory domain services, but it really is the brain and the boss of your network. You should be able to describe briefly what a forest is. And remember, a forest is comprised of all of the domains in your enterprise, all of the domains you may have in your network. It might be 1, it might be 5, it might be 500. But regardless, a forest is simply the domains that you have in your company. Okay, and also you should be able to have an idea of what a domain is. And that's a pretty simple kind of thing. Remember, a domain is just a namespace. It's users and computers that are part of a domain have that domain name in the name. And lastly, you should be able to define briefly what a server role is. And we're going to be looking primarily at the Active Directory Domain Services server role throughout this course, but we're going to be seeing a couple others along the way as well. All right. Well, friends, that wraps up the What is Active Directory video. This has basically been a big old vocabulary lesson. And so now, in the very next video, we're going to actually start building our network from scratch using 2 domain controllers and a switch and an internet connection. So I will see you in that very next video.